Remember in 25, Rick was still in Vietnam and he was still in rehab, and U-Haul had actually come to see him with the picture that the guy had taken of Cracker back when she was, um, remember when she was in her little state of depression and she had been deserted and she decided just to give up. Um, and then he had stuck it on the tree, and U-Haul, somebody had found it and brought it um, to him. And so now he's even more determined to find her, but they won't let him stay in country. They're going to send him back to the United States because his troop, his infantry has stood down. So, chapter 26. Rick was rehabbing stateside at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital just outside of Denver. He rode an Army medevac plane back. Racks of bunks filled the back of the plane for the more badly hurt soldiers. Rick mostly sat up in one of the seats or took walks up and down the plane. He knew the more he walked, the faster he would heal. He hated feeling like an invalid. He didn't know what more he could do to find Cracker when he healed, though. Except for him, everyone had seemed glad to be leaving. It should have been a happy day for him, but all he could think of was Cracker and how he was getting farther away from her. He had looked at her picture once more, but then he couldn't look at it again. During takeoff, he had stared out the window at the tarmac, remembering back to one day when nothing much was going on. Cody had suggested they get their fortunes told by one of the locals who begged around camp. It was just for fun. The woman always said she was a fortune teller before her village got bombed out. Cody paid her $5, and she had moaned and held her head. You could see it all was a big con job. But Cody took it all seriously. She spoke pretty good English and told him he was going to be a senator someday. Rick had laughed at that. She got mad at his laughing and told him she saw Annette. She moaned again and closed her eyes. Annette. At first, Rick thought she was saying the name, Annette. Then she looked at him haughtily and said, "And you are caught in the net." And now, even as the plane flew through the air, he finally believed the fortune teller. From the sky, he saw Vietnam spread out, more pockmarked than when he had flown in. Pockmarked means it's like having chicken pox. It's like the big craters that have been blown out in the surface of the earth, and he can see it from the air, like big holes in the land. He'd heard that at least some of those pockmarks were not bomb craters, but actually craters from burnt-out latrines. He pressed his head to the window. He had the crazy idea that he might spot Cracker down there, but he couldn't even spot the village where he'd last seen her. He'd begged everybody within hearing distance to let him stay to search for Cracker, but basically the Army seemed to be done with him and with her. His first night in the hospital after his leg operation, he dreamed he was rising farther and farther above Vietnam, looking down into the jungles and calling, "Cracker! Cracker!" He'd risen higher and higher until he could see the whole earth sparkling in the cities and dark in the jungles. He'd called and at one point had been rewarded with a desperate bark. And then he woke up. He realized he'd been trying to keep something buried in him, and that something was anger. Not righteous indignation. That's where you stand up for what you believe in. That's what he was always said he had. But anger. The Army didn't care about the dogs. He doubted the Army cared about even him, Rick. They were done with Cracker, and they were done with Rick. They couldn't work anymore, and that was all the Army cared about. He rubbed his eyes and forehead. Cracker was a smart dog. She might make it. He'd left word with the other handlers to watch for her. He thought maybe whoever had taken the picture might have fed and watered her, but even if she made it to American hands, he didn't know what would become of her. He caught a last glimpse of Vietnam as the plane reached the ocean. From the airplane window, the faraway ocean waves made the water seem to quiver. Like a swarm of writhing insects, everything looked like insects, the Vietnam effect. He caught a flash of Saigon, but then all he could see was water. It was over. For him, the war was over. Rick had as much trouble comprehending that concept as he'd had comprehending when the war had begun for him. His parents flew down to visit him at Fitzsimmons during his recovery a couple of times, but all he could talk to them about was his dog. They brought him food. It tasted okay, and told him about the hardware store, the neighborhood, and his friends. But none of it interested him. He saw the way they looked at each other, like maybe he was a little nuts. He was interested in just two things: finding Cracker and exercising rapidly. So he would rehabilitate faster. For some reason, he figured that if he could get out of the Army sooner, he could somehow save Cracker. You know, you always have a job waiting, his father said. When you're ready, of course. Dad, I gotta find my dog. His parents just sighed. He spent all his extra time writing to the same people: congressmen and senators, his mayor and governor, Army officials and buddies, 2020, 20's uncle, and Willie, who'd already written him back twice saying he would write as many letters as he could. Besides Willie, everybody he wrote to was probably getting sick of him. He'd been written to, he'd even written to the President of the United States. Hey, the President knew he'd crossed the border, right? Camel had said so. So maybe he'd remember him and his dog. One day, he even wrote 37 letters, the same number Willie had written him before he was injured. His hand was so sore after that he could barely hold his fork at dinner that night. And yet nothing had come of any of it so far. He was a star patient. He walked and stretched whether asked to or not. And by the end of the month, he was processed out with no more fanfare than the day he checked out of the hospital a few years ago with an appendicitis.